This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Good morning and welcome, colleagues, to Critical Philosophy of Race Here and Now. I, Dr. Nathaniel Adam Tobias Coleman, Research Associate in the Philosophy of Race in the Department of Philosophy at University College London, am Britain's first and only philosopher hired with a specific mandate to research and teach the critical philosophy of race. This is Britain's third conference on the critical philosophy of race, the first being in 1926 at the Royal Society of Arts on the Strand, the second in 1998 here in Senate House. And this, the third, is presented to you jointly by the Institute of Philosophy and the Institute of Commonwealth Studies here at the School of Advanced Studies at the University of London. And we're very proud of this fact, because it is a recognition that what we're engaged in here is the philosophical study of a colonial construct. We also are very pleased and very thankful for the support of University College London, in particular the UCL Department of Philosophy, the UCL Joint Faculty Institute of Graduate Studies, and the UCL Race Equality Steering Group. Furthermore, we're very thankful for the generous contributions of the Mind Association, the Aristotelian Society, Analysis, the Society for Women in Philosophy UK, and the Society for Applied Philosophy. In fact, we're particularly thankful to the Society for Applied Philosophy and to the Journal of Applied Philosophy, which is that society's journal. I, together with Dr. Albert Atkin, who could not unfortunately be with us today, he is still in Australia owing to illness, we will be co-editing a groundbreaking special issue of the Journal of Applied Philosophy entitled Critical Philosophy of Race Beyond the USA. I invite you to submit papers for publication in this special issue. Now, the president of the Society for Applied Philosophy is with us today, and we are very thankful that Baroness Onora O'Neill has joined us to open our proceedings. Professor Onora O'Neill is the chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. She speaks here not on behalf of the Commission, but given that the Commission has responsibility in many ways for a number of protected categories, including race in this country. Without further ado, I shall hand you over to Professor Onora O'Neill.
Thank you, Nathaniel. This is partly a self-denying ordinance. Of course, I would love to talk to you on a more philosophical theme, but I thought that one of the things that just might be useful as a sort of way into this conference is to reflect a little on the sort of legislation that now exists in the UK that bears on discrimination, not, of course, only racial discrimination, and that's what I'm going to do. And in particular, I'm going to talk about the newest tranche of that legislation, the so-called public sector equality duties. Now, I couldn't resist just a little philosophical thought at the beginning. Equality legislation is going to be a complicated thing to do, however you do it. And I think philosophers are in a very good position to explain why it's complicated. it's simply not easy to draft legislation by which one makes some forms of discrimination unlawful, but simultaneously protects the many ways in which we have to discriminate between different situations and cases. And so I find it very important always, when I'm meaning the bad thing, to refer to unlawful discrimination, not just to discrimination. We don't want to be undiscriminating. But on the other hand, drawing the distinction between what should be unlawful and what must remain lawful is very hard. Your job. Now, this is the merest gesture at history. There have been many stages of equality legislation in the UK. We can look right back into the 19th century at the dismantling of formal legal impediments by which some people did not have full standing. For example, the abolition of slavery, the abolition of the exclusion of married women from property rights, the abolition of restrictions on the franchise, which was very gradual and successive, with full enfranchisement of women coming only between the wars. So there are a lot of stages there. Then we have, in the 1970s, quite a lot of anti-discrimination legislation. The Equal Pay Act, 1970, the Sex Discrimination Act, 1975, the Race Relations Act, 1976. And then there was a move, which is the first move about the bit I'm going to talk about, towards defining positive equality duties in 2000. I'll come back to what it means to talk about positive equality duties. And finally, positive equality duties were harmonized and extended in the Equality Act of 2010. And if you want to look at the current legislation, that's the one you come to. Now, what's a positive duty? What is the advantage of having legislation that defines positive duties? The idea is this, that if there's a positive duty to combat something, then change can be more systematic. It won't depend, as it would if you had only anti-discrimination legislation, on individuals making complaints, on ad hoc complaints. It seeks to implement, if you like, Article 7 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all are equal before the law and entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law. Now, what we have got is what are known as the Public Sector Equality Duties, PSED, made up of a general equality duty supported by some more specific duties. The general equality duty is something you can find in section 149 of the Equality Act for 2010. This equality duty is the same for England, Scotland and Wales. Because of the settlement under the Belfast Agreement in Northern Ireland, the situation is a bit different in Northern Ireland, with some rather stronger duties in some cases. And then there are specific duties that were created by a secondary legislation, and they vary a little by jurisdiction, so that England, Scotland and Wales have somewhat differing specific equality duties, and I'm not going to talk about those differences. Now, the public sector equality duty, as you can see by its title, applies to public authorities and also to those acting on behalf of a public authority, so that the duties don't go away if the public authority subcontracts certain services. They remain. This legislation prohibits discrimination on the basis of certain protected characteristics. That's a sort of term of art. There are 9 of these protected characteristics: age, race, gender, disability, gender reassignment, pregnancy and maternity, religion or belief, and sexual orientation. So race is one of the protected characteristics, but the interpretation of race as is appropriate in statute is extremely broad. Nobody's taking a view that this is the correct interpretation of race. It covers discrimination based on colour, nationality, ethnicity, national origin, prospectively caste. Some people try to group these together as descent-based characteristics. It isn't entirely an apt way of grouping them, because of course nationality is not invariably a descent-based characteristic. But all the same, I find that term descent-based somewhat useful. Now note, everybody's going to have a wide range of protected characteristics. Everybody's going to be a man or woman of this age or that age. People are going to have this or that sexual orientation, and so on. So this is not about special protection for some people because they have some special characteristic. Protected characteristics belong to every single member of the population, but we have, of course, different selections of protected characteristics. The general idea then is that public authorities shouldn't treat persons differently on the basis of any of their protected characteristics. And secondly, that they should be able to show that they're not treating people differently on the basis of their protected characteristics. Both steps of that are important. Now, of course, there are exemptions. For example, on age, nobody is saying that a 5-year-old has to have exactly the same treatment as a 65-year-old. That's not part of it. So there will be certain exemptions here and there. And I left out one of the protected characteristics, marital status. Note that it also doesn't follow that every other characteristic will be a legitimate basis of discrimination. For example, if you are an employer and you're interviewing people for a job and you say, oh, he comes from Newcastle, I don't think I'll appoint him, that would be, under other legislation, unlawful discrimination. So the list of protected characteristics is not meant to be exhaustive. These are characteristics that do form a basis for special duties on public authorities. And why the limited number of these characteristics? I think you can see it in practical terms. You can only impose a limited number of positive duties on a public body. If you try to impose hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of positive duties, you just would make a monkey of the whole enterprise, because they couldn't possibly take account of all those characteristics and demonstrate that they took account of all of them in all their decision making. So it's a limited number, and you could argue with the selection. You could say some of them are dramatically less important than others, and that, for example, race and gender are really important in the way that perhaps some of the others are less important. Or arguably age is very important too. No, they aren't ranked, they are simply listed. Now, what does the public sector equality duty prohibit? First of all, it prohibits direct discrimination. That's treating someone with a specific protected characteristic less favourably than you treat other people who don't have that protected characteristic. Secondly, it prohibits indirect discrimination, which is putting in rules or arrangements that do apply to everyone, but that in fact, because of the way they're drafted or implemented or some other consideration, in fact put someone with a specific protected characteristic at an unfair disadvantage as compared to others who don't have that specific protected characteristic. They also prohibit harassment, that is to say, unwanted behaviour that is linked to a specific protected characteristic that violates someone's dignity or creates an offensive environment for them. That's, I think, quite an important one. And finally, they prohibit victimization, that is, treating someone unfairly because they complain about discrimination or harassment. So there are these 4 considerations. Now, in the general duty, public authorities, in the exercise of their functions, that's obviously important because what else do public authorities do? They must, operative phrase of the legislation, have due regard to the need to eliminate unlawful discrimination, harassment and victimization and other conduct prohibited by the Act. So they have to have due regard. And they have to advance equality of opportunity between people who share a certain protected characteristic and other people who don't share that protected characteristic. The Equality Act also sets out a second aim, advancing equality of opportunity, and this requires public authorities to have due regard to the need to remove or minimize disadvantages suffered by people due to their protected characteristics, and it requires them to take steps to meet the needs of people with certain protected characteristics where these are different from the needs of other people. Now you may think, what's that about? Well, actually it's very much about disability discrimination, because there is a positive duty in certain contexts, in employment for example, for employers to make reasonable adjustments for employees who declare a disability, have a disability and declare it. Meeting the needs thing has got above all that focus, but you can see that it's also going to be relevant to the case of children. And it also, the Act also sets out a duty to encourage people with certain protected characteristics to participate in public life or in other activities where their participation is disproportionately low. That, of course, is the consideration that lies behind a current debate about the low number of girls taking up apprenticeships, and encouragement may be required as well as non-discrimination. The specific duties in the Act were created by secondary legislation, and I'm not really going to talk about them, but they differ in England, Scotland and Wales in certain ways, and they include duties to publish information to demonstrate that you comply with the general duty. That's quite important when you think about it. And it doesn't apply to organisations that employ fewer than 150 people. But it would, for example, apply, therefore, to any local authority or big company or other big employer. Secondly, they have to define and publish one or more specific objectives that they think they need to achieve to further any of the aims of the general equality duty. Now, all of that is, if you like, intended to go a certain distance, but it obviously doesn't go quite as far as one might want. What's interesting about it philosophically, you may say absolutely nothing. I couldn't have thought anything more boring than that, but I do understand. I think what's interesting from the point of view of philosophers is that the emphasis is on this notion of paying due regard to certain characteristics when you are making a decision on behalf of a public authority. It is not about quotas, it is about paying due regard. And for example, let us imagine a local authority is thinking of establishing a wonderful new playground. And they think, oh, put it over there and they don't take any view about whether that is equally accessible to children of every background with every sort of protected characteristic. That would be a sign that they had not paid due regard to race, for example, in exercising their duty. Or a case that actually has arisen a couple of times, the closure of public libraries. You can see how the closure of a public library may bear differently on different communities. And the local authority would have to demonstrate that they pay due regard to the accessibility of public libraries from persons from different communities, and that they didn't just say, oh well, we'll close the public library in the poor part of town, or we'll close the public library over there where a lot of people don't speak English. They have to show that they think about it. Well, is thinking about it enough? Some of the legal cases that have already taken place, you must understand this is fairly new legislation. We don't have that number of cases, but we do have cases. And some of the cases that have taken place have been quite interesting because what they actually revealed was a case of public authorities simply sort of blundering ahead and making a decision, oh, this would be a convenient place for the playground, or that would be a convenient library to close, without paying due regard to its impact on equality. And in some cases, they have been required to go back, redo the decision. Doesn't mean they necessarily reach a different decision, but to redo all the working, and in some cases they have had to make considerable reversals. Now, I think the most controversial bit of the public sector equality duty has been a certain, in my view, misinterpretation that it's all about collecting statistics to demonstrate proportionality. And some public authorities have spent an inordinate amount of money on documenting the proportion of people of different sorts with different special protected characteristics whom they employ or who and so on. This is not adequate. That is to say, the duty is not a duty to achieve a certain fixed proportionality across each characteristic. It is a duty to have due regard to those characteristics in making decisions that bear on individuals. Now, this may be all tremendously well known to you, but I think it's interesting. I'm going to finish with one story about one case, because I thought, and I can't at this moment remember the judge's, the case, the name of the case, but the judge was Stephen Sedley, and I thought it was a beautifully argued case. It was a case about harassment on the basis of sexual orientation. And this man was being subjected to terrible homophobic bullying by colleagues, and his employer, an employer of over 150 people, took absolutely no steps to end this harassment. And it was, I have to say, and the judge did say it, it amounted to torment. Now, the interesting thing about the case is, one, the individual who was being tormented was not gay. He was a fairly conventionally married man with kids, and nobody had ever thought that he was gay. Furthermore, his tormentors knew that, but their intention was, as a very, very unpleasant bullying joke, to bully him on the pretense that he was gay, and they were convicted, or rather the local authority was convicted in this case. And I think that tells you this is really a piece of legislation that is designed to bear, probably in slow and incremental ways, on the decision-making of public authorities to alter the way they make decisions. And it has been, as it were, brought before the courts in some rather high-profile cases. Some of them won, some of them lost. This is always, of course, a matter of the facts of the particular case, but including things like changes in disability living allowance, or changes in the availability of certain other benefits, and the impact of getting local authorities to do their pay due regard, not afterwards when they tidy it up and compose some statistics, but at the time of decision making, is I think what's significant about this way of adding to equality duties. That's what I'll say.
Turn this off. You turn it off now.
Yes, okay. Let's open up the.
I must say that one thing that particularly struck me in Professor O'Neill's presentation was the reference to the fact that we are all experiencing selections of protected categories. In fact, I think this points us to an understanding of race that is intersectional. And I encourage us to think along those lines and to be prompted by that thought in Professor O'Neill's presentation. We're going to move swiftly on, but before we do, we're going to have some musical chairs. We have a camera which is pointed at this spot, so your speaker needs to be sitting in this spot. So Professor O'Neill and myself will exchange places with Professor Bernasconi and Dr. Beckles-Raymond. So Dr. Gabriella Beckles-Raymond is going to introduce Professor Robert Bernasconi.
Sorry, it's just disappeared.
He's going to introduce Professor Robert Bernasconi. And please do tweet during the conference. Tweet using the hashtag #CritBillRace. Thank you.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Like I said, I'm introducing Professor Robert Bernasconi. He is Edwin Earl Professor of Philosophy and African American Studies at Penn State University. He received his BA and DPhil from Sussex University, and from 1976 to 1988 taught at the University of Essex, during which time his main philosophical interests were in continental philosophy, especially Hegel, Heidegger, and Levinas. He added critical philosophy of race to that list as a direct result of moving to Memphis. During over 20 years at the University of Memphis, he helped develop a PhD program dedicated to bringing more women and minorities into philosophy, of which I'm a product, actually, I'm proud to say. This commitment to increasing diversity within philosophy has continued since his move to Penn State in 2009. He is the author of over 200 articles, many of which expose the racism of major philosophers, or which alternatively try to develop intellectual resources designed to identify and counter racism. He is co-editor of the journal Critical Philosophy of Race, which is now entering its third year of publication. Dr. Bernasconi.
Thank you very much, Gabby. I want to honour and give thanks to Nathaniel, who has done such a wonderful job in bringing us all together. And I have to say I particularly liked his idea that you all get to email everybody else about your interests, but it is incredibly daunting for a speaker to realize the range of interests and expertise in the room. And so I will try to get through my remarks so that we can have a discussion and I can learn from you. I haven't lived in this country for 25 years, so insofar as my remarks relate to issues of racism in Britain, they're doing so from a distinct distance, and you will be able to correct me and enlighten me. And let me also assure you that I am not on Twitter. So you can tweet whatever you like about me, and I will almost certainly never know unless I have some enemies who want to make my life more miserable than it is already. I'm talking about the work of Sir Michael Dummett and Anne Dummett, specifically in regards to their attempts to theorize racism, and the work that they did in the 1960s and 1970s in this regard. My selection of them is not the claim that they are the most important people, still less the only people doing this. That would not be true. But I think for those of you who are interested in developing courses in critical philosophy of race in this country, and who are facing opposition from people, there's nothing better to be able to attach Sir Michael Dummett's name to an argument about immigration. He himself was really quite angry, at least he indicated this in one text that he published, about the way that professional philosophers had ignored his writing on immigration and refugees. And so I think it's also something I'm very happy to correct that omission today. I'm very happy to have Susie and Nathan Dummett here today with us. Let me just mention four. These are going to be the four main points of my talk, so you see where I'm going on this. They insisted, as you would expect, that you need an analysis of the problem, a clear analysis of the problem, in order to come up with appropriate solutions. And so they devoted a lot of time to theorizing racism, rethinking what we mean by racism. And although I won't say anything more about this today, you should understand that both of them were very actively engaged in the struggle against racism at a day-to-day level. Sir Michael Dummett famously would drive down from Oxford to Heathrow to help asylum seekers. They were writing reports. Particularly important, Anne Dummett's book, A Portrait of English Racism, from 1973, was a record of her encounters as her work as a community activist. And so their theorizing about racism did not derive simply from basic principles, but from practical experience and from listening to people. And I think that's what makes it so valuable still today. What they came to recognize, and I will present some of the arguments that they presented for making this case, is that what we needed was institutional change. That is going to be the second point that I'm going to make. And that they insisted that in designing such changes, they should be directed by those who suffer most under the present system. And so that the task of listening to people was a main focus of their work. The institutional change that they proposed was focused on transforming the establishment. Whereas there was a tendency in this country to try to focus on the alleged racism of what the newspapers today seem to be describing as ordinary people or normal people, thereby trying to normalize a kind of racism. And you see this all the time in the press. They tried to focus on the leaders, particularly the political leaders, the people who write the editorials in newspapers, and show how there is a certain language that they use in a way that seems to legitimate racism. And so philosophy of language was in some ways central to what they were both doing, but it wasn't the analysis of racial epithets, which you see sometimes in philosophy today, and is one aspect of the what we have to do as philosophers. But it focused much more on how people hide behind the racism of others in order to promote their own racist agenda. And fourthly, and I think most important in the present context, is their focus on immigration. I spent the last 3 or 4 weeks working on the archives that we now have at Penn State University on the papers of Anne and Michael Dummett. And then on the plane, I was reading, to get some sense of the background, Camilla Schofield's wonderful new book on Powell and the making of post-colonial Britain. And then I arrived in Britain in 2014, were you? Yes. But I felt I was in 1968. It was absolutely incredible for me to read what is going on in the newspapers, what is being said by the politicians. And I think that here there is something we can really learn from both Michael and Anne Dummet in the way they analyzed the political rhetoric and exposed it. I mean, these are skills that we certainly, I'm sure, all have, but it's very important to share those skills with other people. So those are the 4 points I'm going to be making, and I will now try and make them in a little bit more detail and substantiated. So to begin with the fact that for a problem to be solved, it has to be correctly identified. But they insisted that they did not mean that you should try to define racism or racialism. They use those two terms as interchangeable. Racism keeps reinventing itself. If you try to define it, you're always playing a losing battle because it's always going to have a new form that escapes your definition. They only once tried to offer a definition of racism, and that was when the publishers, Sheed and Ward, were worried that they were going to get sued, and the publishers were going to get sued because they called Enoch Powell a racist. And so they introduced a definition in order that they were able to stand behind it in the courts. But that was the only time they did. The second point that they make is that you cannot successfully combat racism with direct arguments. It's not that kind of thing. Michael Dummetts wrote, racial prejudice is always implacably resistant to rational persuasion. And this puts them at odds with the dominant strategies employed against racism almost ever since the word was introduced. If you remember, the word racism, as many of you I'm sure know this, was introduced into the English language in the late 1930s to refer to Nazi anti-Semitism insofar as it was based on science. And after the war, under the inspiration of Ashley Montagu, a student of Franz Boas, the UNESCO Statement of Race attempted to make the argument, which many of you will know from the way it's sort of been reformulated by Kwame Anthony Appiah, that because there is no such thing as race, according to the scientists, therefore, if racism is discriminating against someone on account of their race, then therefore it's false. It's based on a false belief. But for the Dummetts, racism is not an epistemological error. It is a moral fault, but more importantly, it's an oppressive system. And so they were looking to try to think about racism in such a way that that became identified. And one important consequence of the UNESCO strategy is that it freed the notion of culture to do the work that the notion of race used to do. And so much talk about protecting British culture, for example, is code for a form of racism. It's only because of this false artificial attempt to define race as a scientific concept that then culture comes to be seen as free from any implications connected with race and therefore with racism. Whereas Anne Dummetts was absolutely clear, the real importance of race, she wrote, as now commonly understood, is not biological or scientific at all, but political. And thus, as such, we need to think about race in very broad terms, as to include Romanians, for example, and indeed, we need to look at Islamophobia in the same terms. In fact, one of Michael Dummett's favorite arguments was to say, well, if we're trying to protect British culture, then we should direct all our antipathy against the United States, because they're the ones who are threatening British culture. He sort of sometimes overstated that, I think, but it does correct errors in that argument. So, racism is not only not to be understood as based on a scientific error, it's not to be confined to racial prejudices in the sense of attitudes. One of the problems with a lot of the discussion of racism, as they pointed out, is that it tends to focus on the intentions of the person who is alleged of to be racist. And therefore, as Sir Michael Dummett put it, it allows everyone to be judged in his or her own cause. And obviously that is a severe problem. You know, if I say to you I'm a terribly witty person, you're going to say, well, I'm going to be the judge of that. You're not going to tell me that. But racist, for them, has that same logic. We're going to be the judge of whether you're racist or not. Although, of course, already in 1975, in the White Paper on Racial Discrimination, the argument was that the notion of racism should be freed from intention. But in the popular mind, this still survives as an idea. So in her book, A Portrait of English Racism, which came out in 1973, Anne Dummett attempted to give a survey of the different forms of racism that she had encountered. And I think it's worth mentioning here that Michael Dummett, towards the end of his life, said, I would rather have written that book than any of the many I have written. In other words, he realized the importance of this work in trying to identify different forms of racism. And what she did was she introduced, she was one of the very early people in the English context to introduce the notion of institutional racism. Institutional racism, as I'm sure you know, was a term that's first found in Stokely Carmichael's and Charles V. Hamilton's book Black Power in 1967, where it's understood as the acts by the total white community against the black community. That's what they understood by institutional racism. And this notion has sort of taken on a life of its own and developed. Although Anne Dummett is proposing it in 1973, 1981, Lord Scarman says there is no institutional racism in England, famously. And it's in 1999 that the Macpherson report acknowledges the institutional racism of the police. Her account of it is something like this. Racist institutions, even if operated partly by individuals who are not themselves racist in their beliefs, still have the effect of making and perpetuating inequalities. So it's trying to take the understanding of racism away from the beliefs of individuals and people trying to argue about what it is that people believe and why they act in certain ways, to see rather how things are, the effects of the way things are organized. And so she gave an example, this is one of many she gives, of how if you take a public school, in a sort of British sense of public school, and you bring a substantial number of children there who are from a class or income that would not normally be able to attend that school, very little is accomplished, she would insist, if the language, manners, and expectations of that school go unchanged. In other words, the only way to combat institutional racism is by institutional change. And she believed that only those changes that threaten to destroy the status quo are sufficient. And although this is not the topic of my talk this morning, if we think about philosophy as an institution and what it is going to take to change philosophy in this country, we need to think about things on a major scale. We have to address issues of canon formation and so on and so forth. It's not just going to be by increasing the diversity of the people who do philosophy. And this again is where her insistence, and Michael Dummetts' insistence too, on listening to what people's demands are and what they feel they need is so important. Because to use Michael Dummetts' phrase, white people tend to have what he called a chosen ignorance. A chosen ignorance. That they are inclined to believe what they want to believe what the people they are closest to tell them to believe, in a climate where people are against racism and don't therefore want to be implicated in racism. Although I have to say, one of the most extraordinary things, perhaps even more extraordinary for me than reading what the papers have been saying about immigration, I hope somebody can tell me more about, but this survey of a NatSen, which came out, that The Guardian leaked at the weekend, I think it was, about the number of British people who say they're racist, that self-identify as racist, is extraordinary. That at its height in 2011 it was 38%. Before 2001 it was 25%. At the moment it's allegedly right. I don't exactly know how they determine this, but it is people who self-identify as racist. And I don't know whether this is people who have a guilt complex and who are sort of owning up to things in that way. I sort of rather doubt it. But that, if one wants to sort of contrast the situation in Britain with the situation in the United States, that's a place you can do it. Because although there are parts of the United States where people might proudly proclaim themselves as racist, the numbers would be nothing like as large. And that, I think, tells us something about the way people think about racism here. Let me just quickly move on to my third point, which is that the Dummetts, and I'm referring to them sometimes collectively because they often did co-author articles, they believed that the responsibility for racism lies disproportionately with society's leaders. That's to say with the British establishment, the politicians, the courts, the police officers, the immigration officers, the magistrates, and even they single out on one occasion the Catholic hierarchy. So that racism is not a problem about lack of education, which in some ways would seem to imply that the elite are beyond or above racism. Rather, and here I quote from something Michael Dummett wrote in 1965, "The struggle against racial discrimination in Britain is not principally a fight against racial prejudice, but against the willingness to defer to the real or supposed prejudice of others." And this, in a surprising conjunction, means that Michael Dummett's analysis of racism is very much like that of Jean-Paul Sartre in The Critique of Dialectical Reason, that racism is other-directed. It's always, in some ways, you act or say or behave in a certain way because this is the way people like you behave. And so it is the legitimation of certain practices and beliefs that become so important. And that's why the way people's beliefs and attitudes as they are presented in the newspapers becomes so important and became an object of scrutiny for them. And this is why, I suggest you, if you haven't already, attend to this use of these terms like ordinary people and normal people as a way of members of parliament saying that, well, I'm not a racist, but my constituents are concerned with such and such. That is something about which we have to be very suspicious. So now turning to my last point and focusing on that point which I think for us in this last week following what we've seen in the newspapers has again come to the forefront. For Michael and Anne Dummett, the word immigrant was clearly a euphemism, as we know. In other words, in 1968, the word immigrant is, as part of the language of politics, meant non-white. And so whenever people were talking about a problem with immigration, they meant not a problem with immigration, but a problem of non-white people. And today you find something similar, except that that category now includes Romanians, Bulgarians, but not apparently Germans, who are obviously different. And so this is what both Michael and Anne Dummetts sought to expose by simple thought experiments, or one that I can myself perform, because when people talk about a problem of immigration in the United States, they don't mean me. That's clear. And so for them, this question of honesty, this question of making people own up to what they're really saying was an important strategy. Because as Anne Dummett puts it, if you say there should be fewer immigrants in Britain, in her words, this sounds reasonable to a lot of people. But if you say there should be fewer black people in Britain, as you put it, this sounds unpleasantly racist. And so she argued that instead of talking about immigration, people should be called upon to say exactly what it is that they're talking about. And so this is why you see Nigel Farage gets into a problem as soon as he gets specific, as soon as he names who it is he's talking about. It becomes clear what the problem is. But everybody who is trying to sort of hide behind Nigel Farage can appear better than him because they're not being called upon to say what they really mean. And this seems to me where there is work for all of us to do. That UKIP denounces the racism of the National Front, and this allows the Tories to denounce the racism of UKIP, which allows Labour to denounce the racism of the Tories, but they're all essentially proposing exactly the same policies. And the headline in the Sunday Observer was something of the nature, Miliband must get tough on EU migrants, says MPs. So it's exactly the same rhetoric, and they want to leak, the MPs want to leak that in a way because they're trying to make certain people feel comfortable about holding certain views when it seems that those views should be held to examination and scrutiny. And so the work of Anne and Michael Dummett in relation to racism was to expose in a sober and rigorous way the racism of those politicians who attack the racism of others as a way to make their own racism seem more respectable or invisible. Frank Reeves, in his book British Racial Discourse, some of you may remember from if you're old enough, 1983, I think it came out, looks at this strategy conducted by Anne Dummetts, calls it her analysis of sanitary coding and of discursive deracialization. I don't think those are words that she would ever have rejoiced in using, and I'm not sure that they bring any clarity to the issue. But it's interesting that a book written in 1983 in order to reveal the strategies as well, you know, goes to Anne Dummetts' work to find examples of it. That, as I said at the beginning, we can do this now more readily. We're now familiar with the strategy, but there was a time when this was less widespread and indeed less necessary. So just to close, when I look back at the history of the conceptualization of racism in Britain, it seems to me that Anne and Michael Dummett are major figures. As I said at the beginning, not the only ones, but an important resource for us as we try to change that racist institution, philosophy, as it's conducted not just in Britain, but in Europe generally and in the United States. And as we attempt to hold the press and politicians to account. Because they try to make it sound as if in order to be British, you have to demonize and exclude those who do not share our culture. That's what we have to, that strategy is what we have to expose. I think instead we need to revert to these accounts of institutional racism. We don't have to call it that, but the way institutions in Britain, because of lack of leadership, because of inadequate accountability, perpetuate the divisions within society. Thank you very much.
Okay, we now have plenty of time for questions, so I'm going to take questions 3 at a time, and we'll give Robert the opportunity to answer. So, okay, I'll start here, one over here.
This is really asking for a little more information. When Dummett said that philosophy was a racist institution, was he thinking primarily of 19th century philosophy? Because I heard, written in one of the Sunday newspapers many years ago, that after working on Frege for about 10 years, he was really the first person to work on this German philosopher. After 10 years, he discovered that Frege was a racist and anti-Semitic person, and he had to decide whether to give up his tenure or not. So, I mean, was Sir Michael Dummett really thinking also of today's philosophers and so on?
Shall I answer? Could you want to take more questions?
Yeah, if you could. Yeah, I want to take the questions 3 at a time if we do that. Any other questions? One here. Yeah.
If I understood you correctly, Michael Dummett had the view that we should address institutional racism primarily. However, in your final statement, you pointed out that there's a belief, a widespread belief, that in order to be British, one must disparage and demonize the others. Right? So that's the epistemic consideration, right? That concerns a false belief. So what I'm curious about is whether the Dummetts articulated any notion of the relationship between the epistemic and I would add sort of metaphysical dimensions of race and racism and institutional racism. the mechanics of how things work.
Okay, and last one of this group.
I just simply wanted you to repeat, I wasn't really sure if it was a quote or if it was you sort of synthesizing what the Dummetts argued when you spoke about racism and intention.
Right. Good. So, yes, most of these questions are addressed to the sense in which I, at various parts of my talk, was ventriloquizing the Dummetts, and various parts of my talk was going beyond what they said. So I rushed to say that it was not Michael Dummett who said philosophy is a racist institution, it was me. And when I said that, I did mean it to apply to today. I've been around in philosophy. You just have to look at me, you know I've been around a long time. And I've seen it. I deal with it on a day-to-day basis. And I've heard philosophers say they don't want African Americans in their classes, and so on and so forth. And so I don't apologize. I don't want to back away from that at all. And I think that the fact that philosophy is a discipline has failed to have a debate about the philosophical canon, almost alone amongst humanities disciplines, is absolutely outrageous, particularly because we now have a lot of research which shows that that philosophical canon was in part designed on a racist basis. In other words, if you look back and saw what you would be taught as history of philosophy in Germany in the middle of the 18th century, it would include Ethiopian philosophy. It would include Canadian philosophy, which is how they referred to the philosophy of Native Americans. You know, try your hand at getting a course in Native American philosophy now in most philosophy departments in the United States or indeed elsewhere. And it was really the Kantians, the evil Kantians, as I like to say. Good job, Onora's left. We were colleagues for many years in essence, so I'm allowed to say that. I hope I'm allowed to say that. It was Kantians who established this canon, and then quite explicitly Hegel reaffirms it on a racist basis, is something I've written about. Again, yes, this question about what is the relation between institutional racism and these false beliefs. There are a few passing remarks which seem to indicate that they believe that it is the institutions which are upholding, which make it possible for people to hold these false beliefs. But in their practice, they go after both. And I think that is still the important thing. But I think that the thing that we've learned, and this is, I think, what's so important about the definition of institutional racism that Anne Dummett proposes in 1973, is that it insists on the existence of racism even in the absence of racist beliefs. But of course, insofar as there is inequality, it supports people in the view of then attributing inequality to the races. And so therefore there is clearly this link, but they didn't theorize that, but they were trying to shift the focus of the discussion. So I think it's a very important point you make, and I certainly don't want to imply that these false beliefs, this epistemic part is not important. On the question, the final question about intentions, again, very quickly, I think the point that Michael Dummett in particular insisted upon was that if you say that racism is one of those moral faults of which you are guilty only insofar as you intend it, then you allow people to exonerate themselves. And so then you get the logic of, I'm not a racist, but, and there is no way to argue against that, because you have allowed them to be judge and jury in their own case. And that is why, for them, it was very important to remove the notion of racism out of this narrow moral sphere to which it is sometimes confined.
We'll go here, 2, and 3 over here.
I just wanted to comment on that. You can't argue against that I'm not a racist, but it seems to me quite evidently you can. So the reason to say that you shouldn't allow people to use that as an excuse seems to me independent of the question, can you say anything in response to it? Because most of us are quite familiar with the fact that you can say plenty of in response to it. So, just wanted to make that point.
Okay, second question?
Thank you so much for your talk. I thought one of the really helpful points was the point about not trying to define racism. So I wondered if you could say something about kind of methodologically then, how do we understand it? Is it mostly empirical, so we trace things back to historical roots, or do we look at differential outcomes and figure out the causes? Or and if so, how does sort of philosophy get involved in this, trying to understand racism?
Yeah.
Okay, and the third question was over here.
Yes. Picking up on your response to the previous question, I was wondering, given that they have the view that racism can be unintentional, and given that they also have the view that racism can be performed by non-racist individuals working in racist institutions, I'm wondering whether these two parts feed into any idea about blame. Because there are issues when we're connected with structural oppression as to how much we should be blaming individuals involved and how much we should be involved in practices that involve backward-looking. By backward I mean looking at the past, looking at past actions and whether they are blameworthy, or whether we should be thinking. And here's an idea from Hannah Pickard, a moral philosopher working in a different context, of responsibility without blame, which is a forward-looking idea which she applies to cases actually of criminal responsibility. It's a forward-looking issue which might also have pragmatic advantages, where you might be able to get people on board with changes for the better without, anyway. The pragmatic issues, leave them aside. Do they have views about the role of blame in this?
Right, thank you. Right, very quickly, I should have said you cannot argue successfully against I'm not a racist, as opposed to I'm just. You can, of course, you can argue against anything. But the question is whether you can argue successfully. And the question is, you cannot persuade the individual racist. In other words, so if they have, might be able to persuade other people that they are racists. But if you're trying to eradicate their racism, if they allow themselves to say, I'm not a racist, it can be quite difficult to convince them otherwise. I mean, yes, but there may be individual cases where somebody has a conversion. Let me go to this third question first before coming back to the second one. Because racism has so many forms, which I'll come back to in a second, then there are obviously contexts in which blaming people or calling them out does seem to be singularly important. So when I was trying to call out those Labour MPs, for example, who was calling on Miliband to take a certain stand, I was echoing the way and Dummett in her book Portrait of English Racism, just completely glosses over inner power because that's so obvious. What's the point of blaming inner power? Which she wants to blame Nigel Lawson, because Nigel Lawson, at the time, writes for the Sunday Times and attacks Powell, and then argues that white people should be allowed to get government money to be repatriated to parts of the country where there are fewer non-white people. That's it says, well, this is not legitimate. But of course, he's doing so in a context where that is being sort of presented as a legitimate policy objective because it answers to the needs of normal, ordinary British people who feel uncomfortable under, you know the rhetoric. And so clearly in that case, it seems entirely appropriate for blame. Yes, as a continental philosopher, and particularly one who, working on Levinas and Sartre, this idea of responsibility without blame is something that I'm very familiar with and very supportive of, and I think it's very important. I think that just as racism takes many forms, anti-racism must take many forms. And just as racism is changing, so we need to constantly change. And so I entirely agree with you that there are contexts where if you think you can persuade people to change, and the way to do that is to make it clear that you are not blaming them so that they don't dig in their heels. Well, if that works, do it. But if it doesn't work, then blame them. Yes. Now, your question about defining racism, I think, is a very challenging one for me, because the context, I believe, in which you need to define racism most clearly is the kind of context which Professor O'Neill was talking about, where, in other words, if you have a legal context, and if there is a law against certain forms of discrimination, then that needs to be defined. But if you're a philosopher who is trying to understand why the world is the way it is, how it came about, how racism contribute to the formation of that world, you're very, I think, quickly going to discover, and this is what I've been trying to do, is what I call a genealogy of racism, is how practices, beliefs, and that are racist in one context are not racist in another. And so therefore, any attempt to define independent of context is going to be problematic. And I think that's why we have to sort of resist that effort and instead focus on very contextual, historical studies, which may sometimes sort of lead us to conceptual problems. Just one example of, I think that I got into, the question, was John Locke a racist, for example? Insofar as he's the author of Article 101 of the Constitution of Carolinas, which says every free man of Carolina shall have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves of what religion or opinion soever. Right. Now, how could we not think of that as racist. You know, Negro slaves are being singled out, basically to be under a perpetual death sentence. That's what absolute power and authority means. And yet, people want to argue, have argued against me, that, well, because John Locke didn't have a conception of race as such, and because slavery in the United States, in some sense, doesn't get racialized in a strict sense until very late, insofar as there were people who legally were white, but who nevertheless were slaves in the United States. Jefferson's children, for example, some of those children were white when they were freed, but they were still enslaved because within the context of that slavery, the fact that they had, some of their, they were descended from slaves, in part. So that becomes one of those things that if you have tried to define racism too narrowly, as I think these people who oppose me on Locke are doing, you know, you get into these counterintuitive ideas. It just seems to me Locke's a racist, end of story. Can too, by the way.
Okay, so your hands are up so quickly, I'm going to go here, 2, 3, and I'll get you 3 on the next one. We've got time still.
Just a quick comment on the definition of race in Rome, and also about caste. I won't have time, I won't be able to discuss it, but I don't think there is a definition of race even in the Equality Act. And Onora, you mentioned that. I mean, that is, it just covers a few things: color, nationality, ethnic, national origins, and in the explanatory note, it gives examples of color includes black or white, nationality includes being a British, Australian, Swiss, ethnic, national origin includes this. It gives examples, but it doesn't venture, and I don't think it could, a definition of what. And similarly, that's what we've been saying with respect to caste as well. Why do you need it? India, which has very, very clear legislation on caste, has absolutely no definition of it anywhere. It says that untouchability is outlawed in the constitution, but it doesn't go on to then describe what it is. So it's, I think, the law, even though there is a certain fixity we expect in the application of the law, it doesn't require a definition. So I would think that that's how I understand it. I'm sure there are lawyers, we know from what people said, there are lawyers in the audience who can correct me if I'm wrong.
Let's go to a second question.
I was interested in what you said about how people kind of identifying as racist or people who perpetuate racial prejudice because it's something that people like me should say, or something that people like me should think. And it kind of made me think about the ideas around identity that people like Jay and Cohen and that talked about. But it also made me think about whiteness as an identity, and identifying as white, and therefore what that leads to, how that kind of leads to people thinking, well, I'm white, and therefore people like me should think like that. So I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on what that tells us about whiteness.
Third question.
Right, so you mentioned that people often use the phrase, the problem of immigration as a euphemism for there are too many non-whites in this country. And you offer as evidence that this was a euphemism, that in the United States, you're not perceived as a problem, part of the problem, though you're an immigrant. Though, of course, 100 years ago in the United States, someone with your surname would have encountered quite a bit of hostility as an immigrant. And then you also mentioned that Romanians and Bulgarians are also the object of a lot of hostility in the UK now. Take your point that racism has to be understood in a context-sensitive way. Should we understand the anti-immigrant sentiment in the UK today that encompasses Romanians and Bulgarians as a manifestation of racism in the present context?
No, thank you. And I think that the first question and the third question are clearly linked in some ways, because I can imagine someone who, or some local authority. I mean, when I made that remark about the law, I didn't have specifically that legislation Onora was talking about in mind. But if we, I think there are other legal contexts in which people have tried to define race, and of course this is particularly true in the United States. And again, this reflects the difference between the British and the US context, which Nathaniel is asking us to think about. But one could well imagine that some narrowly framed legislation, which didn't have the 9 points, which are tending to trying to cover everything, or almost everything. So, someone being able to say, well, being Romanian is not a race, and therefore I'm not racist. But it seems to me that the similarity between the arguments, the rhetoric, and the intended effect are such that we have to understand it as racism. There is a sort of move in the United States on the part of some people to sort of it highlights xenophobia as another way of talking about this, and say, oh, well, this isn't racism, this is xenophobia. I'm not convinced that that is a good way to go, but that's a sort of complex set of arguments, which again I think would be strategic and context dependent. I think what I would say is that on this general issue, is when people talk about the problem of immigration, what they tend to mean is the problem of immigrants. Immigrants are the problem, right? That's what they are trying to convey when they use that phrase. And that is just as problematic as those people under Jim Crow saying, you know, there is a Negro problem. In other words, the problem is with them. It's not about us. And just as the sort of answer of Richard Wright was, you know, there is no Negro problem, there is a white problem. So in this context, I think that's how we have to see it. Take the broader view and not allow it to be focused on some population, however it gets determined. And this brings us back to this question about whiteness that is raised. I'm not sure that I know exactly what to say about that. I am of such an age that when I arrived in the United States, it was at a time, 1988, that I had never thought of myself as white. Because that wasn't the language that was predominantly in use in the English context. And actually, before anybody asked the question, this issue of the use of English and British is problematic, I know, and it's one that the Dummetts in their writings focus on in the shift between them. So we need to be alerted to that too. But clearly, what's so interesting about this is, as you indicated, the identity of who is white expands and contracts depending on the context. And again, that indicates the extent to which what we are dealing with is a context-determined, shifting identity whose boundary lines are set by, you know, what we can loosely call the establishment. In other words, they get to control how these terms get used. And you can try, in some ways, to rail against them and so on and so forth. But problematic because, and this is something that I try to argue, although people tend to want to think about race in terms of racial purity, race is, I think, better thought of as a border concept. It's all about where these lines, these shifting lines, get drawn, and who and under what conditions those lines get established. And of course, obviously, in some contexts, accepting a white identity is an acceptance of a kind of responsibility, as opposed to what in other contexts it might be, which would be, an act of aggression, almost, an ownership of a culture, of a history, so a history, which one wants to take pride of, as opposed to a history, a problematic history.
Okay, I said I'd come to this middle section here, the young lady number 1. Can I just call the hand so we can, number 2, gentleman in the middle, and number 3. Yeah, I see, I've got you on the next.
So say that the problems don't just lie with politicians, but in academic institutions where it's very comfortable and entrenched. We're at the very top of academia, we're taught theories from Locke and Hobbes and Montesquieu, all these people that examining and coming with a racial warning to say that their views didn't happen in a vacuum, it came from somewhere. And do you think it's time for maybe an academic revolution? And if so, what shape would that take?
I really hesitate to ask this question in room full of philosophers. I'm not a philosopher. And it's really ties with my first question. You said the philosophical canon is inherently racist. Now, I've never considered the philosophical canon, because I come from an art background, but the artistic canon is assumed to be racist. And I've known that the issues we and others have trying to change the canon to the point where I know it's impossible because it's written in stone, literally written in stone. So, are you suggesting it's possible to change the philosophical canon?
That's actually very related to what I was going to say as well, which is, what do you think kind of practically we can do about this question of the canon? Is it a question of greater endowments for particular areas of study? Because I'm a postgraduate student at King's College, and it's one of the few institutions in the country where you can study Indian philosophy and until recently Islamic philosophy as well. But those two areas are being gradually phased out as the management is changing. So is it a question of getting funding and pushing study into, for example, Ethiopian philosophy or Native American philosophy?
Yes. No, I mean, this is... Given that this is what I devoted my life to, it's surprising I don't have something more profound to say about it than I have. But that's the way it tends to go. I mean, for me, the problem is, jobs for students. If get me notes about this, if you're going to encourage for example, African Americans to go into philosophy when they have other career options, you have to do so in the belief that you think they will be able to get employment as a philosopher in an environment which is hostile and suspicious. That means that in my practice, I find myself in a dilemma. Because if I say to them, well, just study the the philosophers you want to study, and don't study the canon as it's given to us, then when they go on the job market, they will be at a severe disadvantage. Because the department may well say, well, we have a course on African American philosophy, and we teach it once every 3 years. What are you going to do the rest of the time? So that's why I devoted so much time to identifying the racism of Locke, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, Heidegger, whoever, you know. Because I think that is a way in which one can interrogate the canon, interrogate the institution of philosophy, interrogate the ideology on which the world we live in has been constructed, and yet, at the same time, try to move the discussion forward. But yet, I see no reason why the canon should not, the philosophical canon, should not be radically transformed. Because you see other disciplines, for example, literature, which has been much more open to transformation. We see small transformations within the philosophical canon, particularly in the United States, and you've given good examples from King's of how it can be. But again, the problem is that other departments don't look at King's and say, oh, well, therefore we should have courses in Indian philosophy and Islamic philosophy too. They say, no, if that's what you're interested in, that's where you should go. And that doesn't help the students who are taking those courses and hoping to get jobs. So the problem is with professional philosophers who don't understand the extent to which they are upholding an institutional racism. But of course the problem is compounded by the fact that philosophy has tended to define itself so narrowly that there are a lot of philosophers who don't even think the history of philosophy belongs to philosophy. And that is itself considered as not real philosophy. And so the real difficulty, I think, is the narrowness with which philosophy defines itself. And I see that as a political gesture, which, there have been various arguments about this, whether you both believe them or not. There's John McCumber's book, of Philosophy in the Ditch, I forget the exact title. But basically suggesting anyway that analytical philosophy took the form that it did at a time when Marxists were being excluded from American university because they were worried about McCarthyism. And that's why political philosophy emerged, basically disappeared from philosophy departments. And then when it was introduced, or reintroduced, it was reintroduced in this bizarre form, John Rawls, and the rediscovery of social contract theory, which is, to my mind, absolutely bizarre that anybody would think that this was a reasonable way to go about trying to understand the world in which we live in. And so now, finally, we're trying to get beyond the ideal theory and so on and so forth. But you're getting me on a hobby horse.
We've got a couple more minutes left, so I want to come back to this.
My question was about power and knowledge. Who owns and creates that power and knowledge? And how do we change that? How do we, because that's what it's all entrenched in, this whole academic racism is all about. It's power, who creates knowledge, and power and knowledge is all wrapped up in the same kind of thing. And who becomes the experts? And then we just recycle that in different guises.
Well, yes, but my theory is this is the problem of all change in this kind of context, which is you have to, in some way, get yourself legitimated by the old order in order to reintroduce the new. And that is a very painful operation and a very challenging operation. But it's the small fights at every departmental meeting. Every departmental meeting.
We're in those meetings.
What's that?
Who are those neutral?
Well, how do you get it? How do you get in? I mean, but it is possible to get in. But again, you have to have. I mean, and you know, it is. There are universities in the United States where strategies that we have been practicing have brought about a small amount of change. But yes, it's very depressing, and are there times when I wondered whether I should be still continuing to call myself a philosopher. I wonder about that. Wouldn't I be happier in a discipline where I didn't have to constantly fight these fights on behalf of my students and about the students I want to introduce into the discipline? And you know, then I say, I'm damned if I'm going to let these folks have the label of philosophy to themselves. Why should they?
So do your lectures come with warnings that these people that you're teaching have very defined views?
Always. Always. I have a very bad reputation.
I'm afraid
These guys will tell you.
I don't know nothing. It's exactly 11:45. I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up. Other than Nathaniel's going to start cutting his eyes at me. So we will have an opportunity to talk at the other sessions and at lunchtime. So I'm terribly sorry for those who we didn't get to, but we have to move on to the next speaker, I'm afraid. Do you have a break?
Let's give.
Yeah.